37 emails, neatly stacked, unanswered, forgotten. I scrolled through them with a strange kind of detachment, each one a silent echo of the year I spent believing that respect could be earned by staying quiet. Maybe you know that feeling when your effort fades into the background, invisible to the very people who once praised you. This isn't just a story about a raise. It's about something far deeper. Stay with me. I think you'll see a part of yourself in what happened next. When I first walked into the glass-walled lobby of Halden & Co., I truly believed I had found my forever home. I was 34, full of energy, ambition, burning under my skin like a quiet flame. 12 years later, I was still there, older, wiser, carrying more than my fair share of the company's financial backbone. I had built systems that saved millions, negotiated contracts that stabilized entire divisions, led my team through mergers and audits without a single blemish. I wasn't a rising star anymore. I was the infrastructure. On the surface, Halden & Co. loved to celebrate success, polished newsletters, team lunches. The occasional framed certificate hung in crowded hallways. Smiles were plentiful, so were promises. But beneath that glossy exterior, true recognition was reserved for a few. The loud, the flashy, the political. Still, I believed that my work would speak for itself. I wasn't looking for applause. I just wanted fairness. It was early March when I sent my first formal email to Mr. Calhoun, my direct manager, requesting a salary review. I remember the care I took drafting it, highlighting key achievements, attaching performance metrics, linking it all back to company goals. I hit send with a hopeful heart. A week passed. Nothing. Another week, still nothing. At first, I thought maybe he was busy. I gave it time. I didn't want to be that person, the one who nags, who pushes. At Halden, patience was an unspoken rule for people like me. Spring melted into summer. Our department hit record numbers. I drafted another email this time, even more succinct, more data-driven, more deferential. Silence. I began to notice small things. Meetings where my ideas were nodded at but never credited. Initiatives I spearheaded that somehow, once successful, had someone else's name attached to them when presented higher up. Promotions announced for newer employees who hadn't yet seen a single fiscal year through. Still, I told myself, stay steady, play the long game. I kept sending emails, carefully spaced out, always professional, always factual. I documented everything: performance wins, revenue, impacts, cross-functional projects. By autumn, I had sent 6 emails, each one a seed planted in dry, unyielding soil. No answers, just the same strained smiles in the hallway, the same non-committal nods when I mentioned department milestones. One rainy Monday morning, I overheard 2 junior analysts chatting near the break room. They didn't notice me standing around the corner. "You know how it is," one of them laughed. "The only people who get raises around here are the ones who scream loud enough." The words hit harder than they should have. It wasn't anger that flooded through me first. It was sadness, a deep, weary kind of sadness that settled in my chest like damp, heavy cloth. Had I really believed, after all these years, that quiet dedication would be enough, that merit alone would lift me? I stood there for a long moment, listening to the rain tap against the windows, feeling something inside me begin to shift, something I couldn't quite name yet, but that I knew would not be silenced again. That morning marked the first small fracture in my loyalty, a tiny crack that would soon split wide open. I wish I could tell you that realization alone was enough to change things. But it wasn't. Not yet. After that rainy morning, I doubled down on my work, on my professionalism, on my belief that maybe, just maybe, effort would still win the day. I wanted to believe it so badly that I swallowed the growing knot of doubt in my chest and kept moving forward. By winter, I had sent 12 emails, each one crafted with care, each one presenting not just requests but solutions. how my raise could align with departmental goals, how it would reflect the savings and revenue my team had generated. I didn't plead. I didn't demand. I built a logical, respectful case and trusted it to stand on its own. And yet, each email was met with the same weaponized silence. Mr. Calhoun began to avoid eye contact in meetings. He called on me less. He assigned new projects to others' projects. I was clearly the most qualified to lead. Promotions were announced without so much as a courtesy conversation. Bonuses were distributed, and my name was missing from the list, despite metrics that should have made me a frontrunner. One afternoon in January, after a department town hall, I approached Mr. Calhoun directly. I chose my words carefully, my tone even. Mr. Calhoun, I was hoping we could schedule some time to review my salary and role progression. I've sent a few emails, but I understand how busy things get. He smiled that tight managerial smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Of course, Nova, he said. We'll circle back. Timing's just tricky right now. Circle back timing? Empty phrases that fluttered down between us like dead leaves. I thanked him. Because that's what was expected. Because confrontation, real confrontation, would only paint me as difficult. I turned away, feeling the heat of frustration bloom under my skin, but forcing my expression to remain neutral. Always neutral. Inside, something was cracking wider. I began to notice more, now that I allowed myself to see it. How newer hires fresh out of graduate programs were being fast-tracked into leadership pipelines. How men who had been with the company half as long as I had were given stretch assignments. Exposure to executive teams. The language of potential woven into every evaluation. And me, I was the reliable one. The steady pair of hands they didn't have to think about. The one who carried the weight silently so others could run faster. The one who disappeared behind results. One evening, staying late to finalize end-of-year reports, I found myself alone in the office. The city outside was dark and cold windows reflecting endless rows of lights. I looked at my computer screen, at the spreadsheet, tracking my team's accomplishments, and a sudden sharp thought pierced through the fog. They were never going to acknowledge me, not because I wasn't good enough, but because they had no incentive to. I had made it easy for them to forget I had a voice. I sat there for a long time, the cursor blinking on the screen, the hum of the building's heating system filling the silence. And I realized patience wasn't noble anymore. It was a cage. The conflict wasn't just between me and Mr. Calhoun. It was between the person I had been and the person I needed to become. By the time I shut down my computer that night, I wasn't angry, I was clear, and for the first time in a long while, that clarity felt more powerful than any apology or overdue recognition ever could. A few weeks after that late night alone in the office, something shifted. Not in me, I had already crossed a threshold. I couldn't uncross, but in the air around me. One Monday morning, as I sipped coffee at my desk, a Slack notification popped up. It was from Mr. Calhoun. Let's set up some time to review your compensation and role growth. Appreciate your patience. For a moment, I just stared at the message, unsure if I had read it correctly. After a year of silence, of evasion, of manufactured busyness. Now suddenly he wanted to talk. I told myself to stay calm. I typed a polite reply, suggesting a few times later that week. Inside, a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months stirred. Maybe finally someone had realized the injustice. Maybe persistence had paid off after all. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. I spent the days leading up to it preparing. I pulled together a portfolio of my achievements, project outcomes, savings reports, leadership feedback. I rehearsed calm, clear ways to present my case without resentment. I wasn't walking into that room with anger. I was walking in with truth. Thursday came gray and heavy, outside rain streaking the windows. I walked into the small conference room where Mr. Calhoun was waiting, laptop open, notes spread across the table. He smiled warmly, gesturing for me to sit. Nova, he began. I want to start by thanking you for your incredible contributions. You've been a rock for this department. My heart knocked hard against my ribs, but I kept my face neutral. He spoke of my leadership, my reliability, my value to the team. He mentioned budget constraints, of course, but emphasized that my case was compelling and important to the leadership team. Finally, he said, I've recommended a market adjustment to your salary. It's still pending final review, but I expect good news soon. Good news soon, words that should have felt like victory. And yet there was something hollow in the way he said it. Something practiced, controlled. As I nodded and thanked him, that flicker of hope glowed brighter. But it wavered too, like a candle in a room with a window cracked open to a storm. I wanted to believe I needed to believe, but somewhere deep inside, a quiet part of me whispered, not yet. Because promises at Halden & Co. had a way of evaporating. Because I had seen too many soons turn into maybe next quarters. Because experience had taught me that good intentions weren't guarantees. Still, when I left that room, there was a lift in my chest I hadn't felt in months. A fragile, cautious lift, but a lift nonetheless. That night, I allowed myself a small celebration, nothing extravagant, just a good meal at home, a favorite movie, a few quiet hours where hope felt less like a liability and more like a possible future. I even drafted a thank you email reiterating my excitement to continue contributing at a high level. I pressed send with steady hands, determined to hold on to optimism even if just a little while longer. Looking back now, I realized that moment was like standing on a thin patch of ice still intact, but already starting to crack beneath the surface. Sometimes hope is the most dangerous thing we cling to. And sometimes it's the very thing that gives us the strength to see things through. Have you ever held on to hope, even when your instincts warned you otherwise? If you have, I would love to hear your story. Please share it in the comments below. Your experience might just be the light someone else needs. 2 weeks passed. At first, I gave it no thought. I told myself that approvals took time, that budgets were complicated, that patience was still the right response. But as the days stretched longer, that fragile lift in my chest began to sink. Each morning, I scanned my inbox before I even sipped my coffee, half hoping, half dreading what I would or wouldn't find. There was no update from Mr. Calhoun. No salary adjustment, no formal meeting, only silence. Again. The old familiar silence that now felt like an old wound being reopened. Still I waited. I told myself stories to soothe the sting. Maybe it was the fiscal year-end chaos. Maybe HR was overloaded. Maybe he was simply too busy to update me yet. But then, during a casual team meeting one Friday afternoon, Mr. Calhoun dropped a bomb without even realizing it. He announced the promotions for the upcoming year. 3 names, all men. All newer than me. All smiling like kids, handed golden tickets. Not mine. He spoke warmly about fresh leadership energy and rewarding bold innovation. He made eye contact with everyone except me. I sat there still and composed, taking notes as if my hands weren't trembling slightly. Inside a hollow space opened up wide and cold. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I just felt colder, harder, as if some soft, hopeful part of me had finally turned to stone. After the meeting, I walked back to my desk with mechanical steps. I opened my laptop, pulled up the spreadsheet where I had tracked every achievement, every cost-saving measure, every client retention win. I had helped secure all of it. Months, years. And none of it had been enough to even warrant acknowledgement. Later that evening, when most of the office had cleared out, Mr. Calhoun stopped by my desk. He smiled almost sheepishly. "Sorry we haven't circled back yet, Nova," he said, voice casual. "Budget's been tighter than expected. We'll revisit things next quarter. Okay? Appreciate your understanding." He tapped my desk lightly, as if closing a harmless conversation. I nodded. Because that's what was expected. Because professionalism had been drilled so deep into me that even betrayal had to be swallowed quietly. but inside I felt something far different than anger. It wasn't rage. It wasn't sorrow. It was a quiet, clean severance. Something inside me had detached, final and irreversible, as if the invisible tether that had tied me to this company for 12 years had finally, blessedly snapped. I realized then that I was no longer fighting for a raise. I was fighting for the basic recognition of my existence. And if they couldn't or wouldn't see me, after all this time, they never would. When I left the office that night, the sky was heavy with low, bruised clouds. The street smelled of cold metal and forgotten rain. I zipped my coat higher against the wind and walked slower than usual to the train station, letting the chill soak through. I wanted to feel it. I needed to feel it, to memorize the weight of that night, so I would never again forget the price of waiting for permission to matter. That was the moment I truly let go, not with bitterness, not with drama, but with a deep, steady finality that came from finally seeing the truth and choosing quietly, but completely, to never be invisible again. I didn't quit that night. That would have been too easy and too visible. Instead, I decided to do something far more deliberate. I decided to prepare quietly, carefully, without any announcement or anger. Because if they had taught me anything, it was that loudness wasn't respected here. Silence was. And so I made my silence sharp. I started by gathering every piece of evidence I could find. The chain of emails I had sent over the past year. Performance evaluations. Departmental savings reports. Records of projects I had led and accounts I had salvaged. It wasn't about revenge. It was about preserving the truth, about refusing to let my story be erased or rewritten by anyone else. At night, after finishing my regular workload, I stayed behind to comb through documents no one noticed. People are rarely suspicious of the quiet ones. I backed up everything onto a private drive. I documented timelines. I organized proof. Meanwhile, by day, I smiled through meetings. I completed every project on time. I answered every email professionally, courteously, without missing a beat. But inwardly, I had shifted from someone hoping to stay to someone preparing to leave. One afternoon, while finalizing a budget proposal, I received another Slack message from Mr. Calhoun, a casual reminder about team spirit, about everyone pulling together during tough financial times. The irony was almost laughable. I typed a short, polite response. I didn't owe him anything more. By now, my view of Halden & Co. had changed completely. What once looked like a place of opportunity now appeared for what it truly was. A well-decorated cage. The decision to leave wasn't impulsive. It wasn't fueled by rage. It was a slow, conscious unwinding of hope and the steady building of a new foundation beneath myself. I began quietly reaching out to trusted contacts, not broadcasting, not complaining, just letting the right people know that perhaps soon I might be open to new opportunities. It felt strange at first, disloyal almost. But then I remembered loyalty without reciprocity isn't virtue, it's self-betrayal. I refused to betray myself any longer. One evening, while sorting through old emails, I stumbled across one of my first messages to Mr. Calhoun, the one where I had so carefully laid out my case for a raise full of hope, full of belief. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time, not mourning, not regretting, just recognizing how much I had grown, recognizing how different I had become. I wasn't the woman who wrote that email anymore. I wasn't waiting for validation from someone who didn't see me. I was preparing to choose myself. Have you ever reached a quiet turning point, the moment you realized it was time to stop waiting and start moving? If you have, I would love to hear your story. Share it in the comments. Your experience might inspire someone who's still standing at the crossroads. I didn't slam doors. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call anyone out in meetings or write fiery emails meant to expose and shame. No, that was never my way, and it never needed to be. Instead, I let the truth speak for itself. A week before submitting my resignation, I carefully compiled a complete package, a detailed timeline of every contribution I had made over the last 3 years. highlighting revenue increases, cost savings, and department turnarounds that could be directly linked to my work. Attached to it were the 37 unanswered emails I had sent over the past 12 months, each one timestamped, each one professional, factual, respectful, and ignored. I didn't send the package to Mr. Calhoun. I sent it directly to the CEO, the CFO, and the head of HR with a short, courteous cover letter explaining my intent to resign and my gratitude for the years of experience gained. There was no anger in my words, only clarity. I didn't have to embellish anything. The silence of leadership was written into the fabric of every ignored email, every dismissed request. All I had to do was let them see what had been hidden in plain sight. I hit send. And then I waited, not out of fear, but with a kind of calm curiosity, like watching the first drops of rain hit dry earth and knowing a storm would soon follow. It didn't take long. Less than 24 hours later, I received an email from the CEO requesting an urgent meeting. I agreed politely, setting the time for the following morning. When I entered the executive conference room, the tension was so thick, you could almost see it hanging in the air. Mr. Calhoun was already seated at the far end of the table, his posture stiff, his hands clenching and unclenching under the polished surface. The CEO began by thanking me for bringing serious concerns to light. He spoke carefully, as if measuring every word. There was no defensiveness, no excuses, there was only acknowledgement. For the first time, someone in leadership wasn't looking past me. They were looking directly at me, and they were seeing Mr. Calhoun was asked to explain the chain of events. He mumbled something about timing and workload and no ill intent. But the excuses fell flat. The emails told their own story. A story of willful neglect of a leader who had chosen convenience over fairness. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting. Just a slow, undeniable collapse of the narrative Mr. Calhoun had built around himself. By the end of the meeting, the CEO assured me that immediate changes would be made to internal process regarding employee development and salary reviews. He expressed regret that it had taken my resignation to bring these issues into the open. He also offered me a significant promotion, a substantial raise, and a direct reporting line to him if I chose to stay. It would have been easy to say yes. It would have been tempting to accept the recognition that had been so long overdue, but the woman sitting in that conference room was not the same woman who had once waited by her inbox for scraps of acknowledgement. She was someone who understood now that true worth isn't granted by titles or salaries or belated apologies. It's something you claim for yourself and carry with you wherever you go. I declined the offer kindly but firmly. I thanked them for the opportunity, and then I stood up, gathered my things, and walked out of that room, out of that chapter of my life. With my head held high, Mr. Calhoun remained seated as I left, staring down at the table. His downfall hadn't come at my hands. It had come from the weight of his own choices, the missed chances, the ignored voices, the silent dismissal of those who had held his department together while he looked the other way. All I had done was shine a light on what was already broken. That afternoon, when I stepped outside, the air felt different. Lighter, cleaner. I wasn't carrying their failures anymore. I wasn't waiting for someone else to see my value. I had seen it myself, and that was enough. If you've ever chosen to walk away rather than stay somewhere, you weren't valued. You know the freedom I'm talking about. It's not just leaving a job, it's reclaiming your name, your voice, your story, and sometimes that quiet victory is the most powerful strike of all. I sent my final email on a Friday morning, simple, direct, gracious. I informed Mr. Calhoun and the leadership team that I would be resigning, effective 2 weeks from that day. I thanked them for the opportunities I had been given. I made no accusations. I offered no explanations. I simply closed the chapter with the same quiet professionalism I had carried all along. No one expected it. Not really. There were polite emails of surprise. There were awkward smiles in the hallways. There were a few hurried attempts at last-minute meetings. I politely declined because by then my mind was already elsewhere on the life I was stepping into, not the one I was leaving behind. During my notice period, I worked as diligently as ever. I handed off projects. I documented processes. I left everything better than I found it. Not because they deserved it, but because I deserved to leave with my dignity intact. 2 days before my final day, I received an unexpected email. It was from the CEO. He had seen the chain of emails I had forwarded. Calm, factual, undeniable. He apologized for what he called a failure of leadership and communication. He offered me a promotion, a raise, and a seat at the strategic table if I chose to stay. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, feeling nothing. Maybe once, a long time ago, that offer would have set my heart racing. Maybe once I would have grabbed it like a life raft in rough seas. But not now, because the woman who had waited and hoped and stayed quiet was gone. I politely declined. I wished them well, and then, on my last day, I walked out of Halden & Co. for the final time. No parade, no dramatic exit. Just the quiet sound of my own heels against the marble floor. The weight of 12 years falling away behind me with every step. Outside the sun was shining. It was the kind of day that felt too bright for goodbyes. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, the crisp air, the sharp clarity of it all. I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I was leaving with the one thing they could never take from me, my sense of worth. A few weeks later, I started a new chapter at a company that valued transparency growth and true leadership. It wasn't just a new job, it was a reclamation. It was a choice to never again settle for being unseen. Looking back now, I don't regret a single email I sent or a single moment I spent hoping. Because each step, each disappointment had led me here. Here, where my voice is no longer something I apologize for. Here where my value is recognized without begging for acknowledgement. Here where I remember every day that respect isn't something you earn from people who refuse to see you. Respect is something you grant yourself first and fiercely. If you've ever walked away from a place that couldn't see your worth, know this. You didn't lose anything, you found yourself. And that, my friend, is everything. Your new compensation reflects our evolving priorities. That's what he said, word for word. No warning, no apology, just that 40% of my salary gone. Effective immediately. I sat there in a meeting I didn't know was a meeting, across from a man who didn't flinch when he said it. I didn't ask questions, I didn't raise my voice. I simply placed both hands on the conference table and let the silence settle. That was my answer. I didn't fight back, I didn't argue, but don't confuse silence with surrender. Stay with me until the end, because what's coming next will flip everything they thought they controlled. He slid a thin folder across the table. Please sign this acknowledgement form by end of day. The word acknowledgement was doing a lot of work. No room for negotiation. No space for dignity. Just a quiet betrayal wrapped in corporate language. I glanced at my laptop screen. My inbox had one unread message, subject line. Salary realignment memo. Effective immediately. No greeting. No explanation, just a spreadsheet with a new number. Next to my keyboard was a small gray USB drive. It had been there for years, inside it. Every architecture file, every process map, every ounce of sweat I'd poured into the backbone of this company. They could cut my pay, but that was mine. Drive. I stared at the email again, then slowly reached forward and unplugged the USB, not in protest, not in anger, just quiet closure. Sometimes the smallest gestures are the ones they notice too late. I stood up, smoothed my blouse, collected nothing. Outside the glass meeting room, the hallway was empty. A motivational poster read, "Innovation starts with us." Apparently not with me. I walked down the hall, slow and steady, until something caught my eye. A new nameplate, freshly mounted office, still untouched. The name was short, young male, and the last name matched the CEO. I didn't need to ask who he was, I already knew. And just like that, it clicked. This wasn't about performance, it was about placement. What was framed as budget alignment was just a shell game. My cut funded someone else's raise, someone who hadn't earned it, someone who hadn't been there when I stayed past midnight, rewriting infrastructure to keep us from losing a major client. The real insult wasn't the pay cut. It was the message, "You're replaceable." But they had no idea what I still held. I didn't look back, and I didn't reply when the manager called after me. "You're still part of the team. Tessa just restructured." I kept walking. Back at my desk. My access badge had already been revoked from project management permissions quietly. Preemptively, I opened my drawer not to pack, but to think. My name hadn't been removed from the company, just from the credit. I looked down at my empty screen and asked myself, did I do something wrong? Or did I simply do everything too well for too long? I didn't say a word. But that silence, it wasn't agreement. No one called. No one texted. Not even the ones who used to slack me for every little thing. I walked into my apartment and dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. The sound echoed louder than usual. Maybe because the silence inside had become unfamiliar. On my kitchen counter, an unopened energy drink sat exactly where I'd left it that morning, before the meeting. Before the memo, before the restructuring, that wasn't really restructuring. Just a polite word for replacement. I stared at the can, cold untouched, like I had never come back to claim it. I didn't check my phone. I didn't open my laptop. I already knew my work email was logged out. Credentials expired. Calendar erased. I had been wiped like a failed update. I leaned against the countertop, arms folded tightly, forehead resting on the inside of my wrist. The kind of posture you fall into when your thoughts are too loud to sit with. I stayed like that for minutes, maybe more, until the back of my neck felt the warmth of the late afternoon sun slipping through the blinds. I sat down on the floor, not out of exhaustion, but because I needed the ground. Something real. Something still mine. From this angle, everything looked different. The living room was bare, not by design, just by neglect. A bookshelf half full. A desk cluttered with unopened envelopes. A couch I hadn't sat on in weeks. I used to come home too tired to notice. Now I had time to see what my life looked like without the job, and it was hollow. For the first time, the thought hit me in full. I didn't leave. I was erased. Not fired, not reprimanded. Just erased. I had been told I was a pillar. Now I was air. All those years being the one they could always count on. The one who fixed things at midnight. The one who cleaned up messes without ever asking for credit. None of it mattered. The company didn't even make an announcement. No farewell? No thank you for your service. Just silence. And somehow that hurt more than anger ever could. I pulled out the drawer of my side table and took out a single item. A folded piece of paper. A diagram printed in faded ink. One of the first system maps I ever built for them. It still had my notes scribbled in the margins. I ran my fingers over the lines tracing where the data pipelines flowed, where the firewalls overlapped, where I'd solved a critical flaw before anyone else had even seen it. That diagram, years old, was still the version they used in production. No one had ever updated it, and yet they thought I was dispensable. I folded the paper again, carefully this time, and slipped it back into the drawer. It was like tucking away a version of myself that no one else remembered. From the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed a soft, low reminder that life goes on even when your name vanishes from the org chart. Then my husband stepped through the door. "Everything okay?" he asked. I turned to him and nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just tired." He stared at me for a second longer than necessary, but didn't press. And I was grateful, because I wasn't ready to explain how someone like me could be pushed out so quietly. Have you ever been sidelined, not because you failed, but because you made others uncomfortable by doing too well? If that's ever happened to you, what made you stay silent, and what would you do differently now? 3 days passed before the first system alert landed in my personal inbox. Not work email. That was long gone. This one was different. A backup address I had linked years ago as a failsafe. I never removed it. Subject API. Failure workflow timeout detected. Timestamp 3:14 a.m. The same hour I used to push emergency hot fixes when no one else was watching. I didn't open the message right away. I stared at it, blinking against the screen glow in my dark apartment, wondering if it was a mistake. But a second email came an hour later. Then another. It wasn't a glitch. It was a warning. And it was exactly what I expected. They'd put someone new in charge. Someone with a glossy resume and zero historical knowledge of the system. And now the architecture I'd built with all its interdependencies and quirks was beginning to unravel. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, arms folded over my chest. The city outside was barely waking. Neon signs flickered off. The orange haze of sunrise crept along the windowsill. I reached for my coffee mug, but realized I hadn't brewed anything. There was no point. My morning didn't start the same way anymore. I walked to the window and stood there for a long moment, watching the light shift on the glass of the building across the street. Their windows still lit, still humming. Mine dark. But that didn't mean I wasn't watching. My phone buzzed. A message preview blinked across the screen. Hey, did you hear what happened in the release this morning? Total mess. Lena, a developer from my old team, Smart. Careful with her words. I didn't reply, not because I was bitter, but because silence was its own kind of power. Let them wonder where I went. Let the absence speak louder than any accusation. I sat down again, opened the same folder on my desktop. I hadn't touched since leaving. Inside were copies of release logs, access trails, and handwritten notes I had digitized over the years. It wasn't sabotage, it was memory. And they had erased the person who held it all. I opened one of the logs and scrolled. At line 234, I saw it. Override triggered, no source rollback defined rookie mistake. They'd overwritten part of a chain that connected 3 subsystems ones I'd built manually because the template versions were flawed. And now they were trying to run it on automation without documentation, because no one had ever bothered to write it down, because I was the documentation. I closed the log and ran my fingers over the edge of the table, feeling the wood grain bite beneath my nails. This wasn't revenge, it was recognition. They removed me for optics, for politics. But the systems weren't loyal to politics. They were loyal to logic, and logic always traces back to origin. I opened Lena's message again, then archived it without typing a word. If they needed help, they knew where to find me, but I wouldn't move first. The chain of failures had already begun, and every new alert was a breadcrumb. I didn't have to leave. The hallway light flickered above my desk, the same way it had the night before I delivered our first stable deployment. That night had blurred into memory, but the feeling, the hum beneath my skin, the way silence folded in around the tapping of keys, was still traceable, like phantom pain from a healed wound. I hadn't meant to open the old storage box, but my hand had hovered near the closet door long enough to betray me. Inside binders thick with drafts, diagrams, and revision notes, code reviews printed on paper because I never fully trusted the archive system. A single USB drive unlabeled still in its plastic case. Untouched. The weight of it all hit me harder than I expected. I sat down on the floor again, back against the cold wall, and opened the top binder. The pages crackled like a voice I hadn't heard in years. Mine, in faded ink. Data bridge fails at threshold 8. Patch manually until fix is stable. Next to it, a small note scribbled in the margin. 53. AMT still awake. That was from Lena. She used to leave those messages as a joke when she'd come into the office early and find me still logged in from the night before. We used to laugh about it. Now it felt like a relic. I flipped to another page, an architecture flow I'd built from scratch. Not because it was in the job description, but because no one else knew where to start. I remembered that night clearly, the hum of the vending machine, the fluorescent light buzzing, my hand wrapped around a lukewarm cup of instant coffee. That I never drank. I'd stayed until sunrise. No one asked me to. No one remembered it either. I pressed my fingers to the edge of the diagram. The ink had smudged slightly at the center, where I'd rested my wrist too long. I hadn't just built code, I'd built spine, and they cut it out without asking what held it together. The irony twisted in me like wire. They had once denied my request for documentation support because it wasn't critical. Now they were crashing from the lack of it. Back then, I didn't argue. I documented it all myself. Quietly, relentlessly. The white noise of the room settled into my ears like snowfall. I closed the binder and looked around the apartment. No plaques. No awards. Just stacks of brilliance. No one ever clapped for. I walked over to my small desk by the window and laid the binder flat under the afternoon light. The sun cast long, slanting shadows across the page, cutting through the room like memory slicing present time. There was something sacred in the old systems, something human. That's what automation never understood. They replaced me with someone who knew frameworks, but frameworks didn't know what we had to bend to make things work. No template could anticipate the corner cases I solved at 2 a.m., or the team dynamics I managed while triaging fire after fire. There's no field in the codebase for emotional resilience. I sat down, hands folded. No tears, no speeches. Just the quiet, undeniable knowing that I was the living memory of what they were now trying to rebuild from scratch. And they had cut that memory loose without a backup plan. The first message came at 2:09 a.m. Urgent system instability detected in Module 3. Requesting historical input logs. Please advise. It wasn't signed, but I recognized the sender from the routing address. Internal escalation. I didn't answer. A second message followed 30 minutes later, flagged high priority. Then a third. By dawn, I had 6 unread emails from 3 different engineers and 1 project manager I hadn't spoken to since the day I was realigned. I made coffee slowly, deliberately, measured the grounds, boiled water by kettle. Each step was a pause, a decision not to react. The inbox stayed open in the background, the red notification dot growing like a wound. No one knew how to dress. The system was buckling, and they were hoping the one person they discarded was still generous enough to save them. I sat by the window with my mug watching the steam spiral upward into the morning light. The air was still, my apartment quiet, but my mind was anything but. They had cut my pay by nearly half, told me it was structural, and now that structure was bleeding from its seams. They didn't even try to hide it anymore. The new hire, CEO's son, was on LinkedIn last week, bragging about his first system redesign. He'd posted a screenshot of code I wrote 5 years ago. Did he think no one would recognize it? Or did he think I was too quiet to care? I pulled my laptop onto my knees and opened one of the messages. Inside was a screenshot of a broken log chain and a single line in bold. No fallback detected. Who set this structure? There it was, a system I designed, a failure I predicted, and a question that screamed without knowing who to ask. I closed the message. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindicated either. What I felt was closer to something colder. Like metal under your skin on a winter day, something sharp and distant and perfectly intact. They didn't believe me when I flagged this vulnerability in a planning session 6 months ago. Over-engineering the CTO had said, "Let's not slow down innovation with hypotheticals." Now the hypothetical had become real. And they were scrambling without a compass. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my own archive. My notes, my test cases, my architecture drafts, meticulous and exact. Not because I had to keep them, because I didn't trust anyone else would. In a separate folder, I found the documentation request I had filed last year. It was marked, denied, non-essential, non-essential. I could feel a strange heat in my chest, not from anger, but from clarity. They hadn't just overlooked me, they had underestimated the system I built, and now they were trying to rebuild it in the dark. My phone buzzed. This time a message, Tessa. I know we didn't part on great terms, but we could really use your eyes on this. Let me know if we can talk. Clara. Clara! The only PM who ever backed me in public. Her voice had always carried caution, but this one held desperation. I looked at the message for a long time. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I needed them to sit in the quiet they once left me in. I placed the phone screen down and walked across the room. The sun had risen fully now, light pouring through the window, cutting hard angles across the floor. I stood there barefoot, still in silence, watching the day sharpen everything. This wasn't a victory, not yet. But it was the beginning of the correction, and they were starting to learn, you don't erase someone like me without the system noticing. What about you? If a company once dismissed your value and now they need you back, would you return? Or would you let the silence speak for you? It started with a LinkedIn message. Short, direct, no frills. Tessa, I saw your name in a thread about scalable infrastructure. We're looking for someone to lead architecture on a multi-region system. Would you be open to a conversation? R. Daniels, CTO. Calix Systems. I read it twice, then once more, slowly. I hadn't applied. I hadn't posted. My profile hadn't changed in months. Still muted. Still careful. But apparently someone had spoken. Someone remembered. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I closed my laptop and walked to the kitchen. I needed movement, something grounded. The quiet weight of attention, after silence, can feel heavier than you expect. The morning sun hit the counter tiles, throwing white rectangles of light against the cabinets. I reached for the glass. I always kept in the same spot, filled it with water from the tap, and stood there holding it with both hands. Not drinking, just holding, as if the cool weight could help me absorb the moment without tipping. There was a time when being noticed felt like a chase, when I had to raise my hand, remind people I was still in the room. Now they were reaching out, not because I asked, but because the cracks I used to catch were starting to show. And my name was being whispered, not in meetings, but in problem-solving threads and circles where impact mattered more than titles. I walked back to my desk and opened the message again. His tone wasn't inflated. It didn't carry desperation. It carried curiosity and quiet respect. I clicked into his profile. 15 years in engineering, published on resilience frameworks. Someone who didn't confuse noise with knowledge. My chest tightened, but not with fear, with unfamiliar recognition. This wasn't a rescue. It was an invitation. I replied with a single line. Happy to connect. Let me know what time works. 10 minutes later, the calendar invite appeared. Wednesday noon virtual. The morning of the meeting, I wore the same blouse I had worn to the last town hall before the salary cut. Back then, I wore it to feel professional. Now I wore it to reclaim it. I sat by the window where the light was clean and full. My laptop angled just right. Background clear, posture quiet but assured. When the call connected, he didn't waste time. I've read through a few of your published diagrams, he said. Some of your optimizations are still referenced in training decks, especially that serverless pivot. That stopped me. They were still being used. I didn't know that, I said softly. He smiled. You probably wouldn't. They stripped attribution when the documents were migrated during that merger, but we kept the structures. That small sentence said everything I had been erased from one place but preserved in another. We spoke for 40 minutes. Not about titles, not about buzzwords. Just systems, failure points, design thinking. The language I knew best. At the end, he leaned back slightly and said, I'm not looking for someone to follow templates. I'm looking for someone who remembers how the thing was really built. I didn't blink, I just nodded. Because finally, someone was speaking my language. That afternoon, I sat with the offer on my screen. It wasn't just higher pay, it was autonomy, respect, a seat at the design table from day one. But it was more than that. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I had to prove I existed. And I hadn't said a single word about what had happened before I didn't need to. I printed the offer letter, not for legal reasons, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it in my hand. I folded it once slowly and placed it beside my old system map. Two versions of me, side by side, the one they dismissed and the one they called for without even knowing the whole story. It was Lena who slipped me the file. No preamble, no warning. Just a message sent to my personal email subject line blank with a single attachment. Restructure. Proposal /Q4. Internal draft. XLSX. I almost didn't open it, but something about the silence that followed, how she didn't follow up, didn't even nudge, made it feel more urgent than if she had. I waited until the house was still. No music, no lights, just me and the document glowing faintly on my screen, like a pulse in the dark. The spreadsheet wasn't remarkable at first glance, just cells numbers and department codes, but tab by tab the picture formed. And it was ugly. Tab 3, Adjusted Compensation Strategy. Next to my name. Yes, my full name was a red cell with a comment bubble. I clicked, Replace with more media-friendly profile. Consider younger male talent to modernize leadership optics. I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't believe it, but because I had already suspected. Still seeing it written so clinical, so intentional, made something quiet inside me recoil. Not with rage, with recognition. I had always known it wasn't about budget. It was about image. Scroll down 2 rows below me. B. Mathis. Proposed salary $142,000, the CEO's son, the one with my old office. His compensation was listed under a budget line marked Strategic Retention. Strategic, that's what they called nepotism now. Tab 5. Exit phase, phase 2. Next to 2 other names. I recognized. Ramon and Jaden. Both veterans. Both suddenly reassigned or transitioned right around the same time as me. This wasn't isolated, this was a campaign. I leaned back in my chair, slowly folding my arms as I stared into the dim-lit room. My reflection blinked at me from the screen, tired but alert. Not broken, just done pretending, I got up to pace barefoot on the cool hardwood, letting each step pull me deeper into what I now knew for certain. They had engineered my exit, and they had used my silence to pave the road for it. In their minds, I wouldn't fight, too measured, too polite, too absorbed in the work to challenge the story. They weren't wrong. Until now. The next morning, I opened my email again. This time, I forwarded the file to an encrypted archive with a time lock release, not as revenge as leverage insurance, because no matter how careful they were, someone always forgets the paper trail, and in their arrogance, they'd forgotten one very inconvenient truth. I read everything, and I never delete that afternoon. Lena called. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't apologize. She simply said, I found it on the shared drive. HR thought it was locked. It wasn't, I listened. I didn't know until I saw your name. And then Ramon's. They did it on purpose, Tessa. They made it look like budget, but... She paused. You were the anchor that made you a threat. I let the words land. Then I asked quietly, why now? Lena's voice cracked, not with fear but exhaustion. Because it's starting to fall apart, and I don't think they deserve to collapse in silence. I hung up and stared at the ceiling. All those performance reviews, all the years they said irreplaceable, and now I had been cut. Not because I was weak, but because I stood in the way. They didn't downsize me. They removed me deliberately, strategically, and with full knowledge of what I carried. But they had miscalculated one thing. I hadn't come to rely on their platform. I'd always built my own. I didn't rage. I didn't call HR. I didn't forward the file to a journalist or post a bitter message on LinkedIn. I built a folder. It sat quietly on my desktop, labeled only with a single character, T. Inside it, I began drafting a framework, one I'd envisioned months ago when I still believed in improving what we had. Now I was building something after I didn't even know what to call it at first. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a backup. It was something between memory and blueprint. A system stripped of corporate ego, lean, transparent, secure. A version of everything I had once tried to make work under people who never really understood the bones of it. I wasn't starting from scratch. I was refining what I had always carried. My old diagrams lay beside me on the floor, hand-marked PDFs and post-it notes still stuck along the edges. I ran my fingers across one of the pages, tracing the path from input to output like muscle memory. No one had ever seen this version but me, and no one else ever would. This wasn't meant to be pitched. It was meant to be proven. I kept working in the hours they weren't looking for me. Early mornings. Late nights. I didn't ask for access. I used what I still had: peripheral credentials, cached backups, performance logs, routed through a personal endpoint I had created 2 years ago when the system kept dropping packets during deployments. They thought they had removed me. What they didn't realize was that I had never fully given them everything. The real architecture wasn't on the shared drive. It was in my notebooks, my scripts. The handwritten diagrams I never uploaded because it would confuse the others. Now I understood why they were confused. They never learned how the system actually breathed. At noon, I stepped away from my screen to rest my eyes. I pressed my palms against my face, then let them fall slowly into my lap. I felt strangely calm. Not victorious, not vindicated, but steady. I had nothing to prove anymore, but I had something to protect. My work, my name, my future. Across the room, the soft chime of an alert blinked on my secondary monitor. Another error. Another system freeze, the 4th this week. They were unraveling, and I wasn't watching anymore. I was writing a new map. Later that day, I reconnected with a contact I hadn't spoken to in years. A cybersecurity consultant I'd worked with briefly during a high-risk data migration, someone who knew the value of clean code and cleaner exits. I sent him a message. What would you charge to stress test a live system replica? Hypothetically, he replied 5 minutes later. Depends who's watching and who's pretending not to. I smiled. There was something reassuring in talking to someone who didn't need context to understand the stakes. I didn't want to destroy the system. That would be too easy. I wanted to replace it silently, elegantly, so when it finally collapsed, something better already existed. Mine, not for them. Not even for vengeance, for the ones who still did the work, for people like Lena and Jaden, and Ramon discarded too soon, and thanked too little, for the future team that would never know my name, but would run on the system I left behind. That's legacy. The next morning, I booted the prototype. Lines of code rippled across the screen, like quiet defiance. The first test passed. The second followed. By mid-morning, a shadow of the old system stood up on a private server, lighter, faster, untouched by politics, and no one even knew it existed. I closed my laptop, exhaled slowly, and reached for my mug, still warm from the coffee. I had forgotten to finish. I didn't need them to crash to win. I just needed to make sure I was no longer tied to their fall. It started with a flicker. One of the company's client portals blinked out for 26 minutes on a Thursday morning. Nothing dramatic, just long enough for 3 financial transfers to fail and 2 vendors to flag their contracts for review. By noon, the internal Slack channels were flooded with messages. Is this just our region? Anyone else seeing authentication delays? Can someone ping DevOps? No one had answers because no one knew the architecture they were running anymore. By Friday, the flicker became a glitch. The system's load balancer began dropping requests in peak hours. Cache overflow, log rotation failure, the kind of issues that hide in plain sight when you build on something you didn't understand. They'd built over my foundation like it was a parking lot, never asking how deep the bedrock ran. Now the cracks were showing. I received the first client-facing email by accident. Someone had forgotten to scrub an old alias from the CC list. Subject urgent. Possible breach. Legal review. requested from the head of risk management to the CTO. No mention of me, of course, but I was in every line of the story. I stood at the window that afternoon, hands resting on the cold frame, watching the rain streak down in long, uneven lines. Inside my apartment was quiet still, but inside them, chaos. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel pity. What I felt was detachment, like watching a storm pass over a house you no longer lived in. The next morning, I received a message from Lena. Just one line, "It's happening." No further context. None needed. I opened the internal dashboard, one I still had limited read access to, through an old testing credential. No one ever deactivated. Red alerts everywhere. Subsystem timeout. Authentication, error. Missing audit trails. Clients unable to access invoices. One of the legacy vendors had submitted a formal complaint. Another had frozen billing until the issue was resolved, and the thread tying all of it together, they couldn't find the person who designed the system because she didn't exist on paper anymore. Back when I was still there, I had asked more than once for a support team to maintain the system. They'd said we didn't need it, that I was the team. Now they were discovering what happens when you cut the engine and expect the car to keep driving. The architecture wasn't broken, it was missing its memory, its context, its spine. They could trace every alert. But not the thinking behind it, because that was me, and I was no longer in the room. I closed the dashboard and returned to my own interface. Clean, quiet running, perfectly. My prototype had already absorbed half the load from my personal sandbox simulation. The logs were intact, the documentation auto-generated, the notes indexed by decision trail, not just technical spec. Everything they said was too complex to bother with. I had built anyway. They didn't believe I was necessary. Now the system was showing them otherwise, and I didn't have to lift a finger. They thought I didn't matter, now they have to ask. Can the system survive without her? What about you? Have you ever proved your worth, simply by stepping away? The call came in at 7:12 a.m. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew exactly who it would be. I let it ring twice, then 3 more times, then silence. It buzzed again. Less than 5 minutes later, this time voicemail didn't play it right away. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and filled the kettle, the soft click of the burner, the low whistle, the act of doing something entirely ordinary. That was my answer to their panic. When the kettle finally cried, I poured the water slowly over tea leaves in a glass cup. Let it steep. Let it breathe. Only then did I sit down, fold my legs under me, and press play. Hi, Tessa. This is Martin. Look, we really need your insight. The system's in rough shape, and we're under pressure from clients. I know things weren't handled well before, but if you're open to it, we'd like to invite you to a conversation. Hey, Asabe. Call me back? He tried to sound composed, but the undertone was unmistakable. He was scrambling. Martin hadn't spoken to me directly since the day he told me, "This realignment isn't personal. It's strategic." Now he was hoping strategy worked both ways. I placed the phone down face down and stared at the table. Not out of anger, not from pride, from consideration. There was a time when that kind of message would have shaken me. Not because I needed the job, but because I needed to be seen. Now, I didn't need their apology. I didn't need their crisis. What I wanted was something quieter. Control closure, clarity. I walked to the window. Rain again, a soft, consistent drizzle that blurred the skyline into watercolor. Behind me, my laptop blinked. One of the simulation tests had just passed with a 92% efficiency rate. My system was running beautifully. Stable, elegant. When I returned to the table, I drafted a reply. Not to Martin, but to Clara. She had called weeks earlier. The only one who reached out with something resembling decency, I typed. I received Martin's message. I understand the system is in crisis. I'm not looking to rejoin, but I'm willing to participate in a single strategic handover on my terms. Let me know if leadership is open to that conversation. I'll outline my conditions by end of day. Then I hit send. I didn't flinch. That afternoon, I sat with a pen in hand and wrote down what had never been offered to me when I was still on the team. A proper title, autonomy over my own architecture, public credit for what I'd built, and one last clause, full resignation to follow handover. No return. No rehiring. This isn't a negotiation. It's a transition. It wasn't revenge, it was a boundary, and boundaries are a language too. By evening, Clara responded. Understood. I'll present this to them. Honestly, it's more than fair. I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel satisfaction. But I felt still, like I'd drawn a clean, unbroken line between who I had been and who I was now, and they could cross it only once, on my terms. In my timing. At a cost. I walked back into the building the following Monday. Not through the side entrance, like before. Not carrying a laptop bag or a security badge. Just me. A small folder in one hand, and a timeline running quietly through my mind. The receptionist didn't recognize me. Why would she? Turnover had been high lately. I signed in as a guest. First name, last name, no department. The pen hesitated in my hand for a fraction of a second when I wrote it. Not because I doubted, but because it felt final. I placed the pen down with care, the way you might set down a letter you had no intention of picking up again. They escorted me to a conference room on the 12th floor, a floor higher than where my old office used to be. A symbolic distance inside a long rectangular table stretched across the room like a negotiation platform no one had prepared properly. Martin was already there. So was Clara. A few others sat at the far end faces. I barely recognized anymore. They stood when I entered out of reflex or guilt. I couldn't tell. I didn't sit immediately. I placed the folder gently on the table and stayed standing. Let the silence stretch. Let them feel what it was like to wait without control. Martin finally cleared his throat. Tessa, thank you for coming in. We appreciate your willingness to help stabilize the environment. We understand you have some terms. I nodded once. Calm, unhurried. I'm not here to rejoin the company, I said, voice steady. I'm here to complete a strategic handover. After that, my involvement ends permanently. The words landed sharp and deliberate. No softening, no apology built into them. Martin shifted in his chair. His hand twitched toward his coffee cup, but didn't pick it up. I opened the folder. Inside, a printed outline of the system vulnerabilities I had identified in the past 6 months. A phased stabilization plan, a contact sheet of third-party consultants they could hire to repair the worst failures. I had done the work, but I was no longer offering my hands to carry it. I slid the documents across the table, letting them feel the weight of it in the gesture. I'll walk through these recommendations today. I said, still standing, then hand over the materials. After that, I expect no further contact. Clara nodded. Martin hesitated. Tessa, if you'd reconsider staying on in a consulting capacity. No. I interrupted, quiet but absolute. I don't consult for organizations that erase their architects. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Outside the glass wall, the city blurred into streaks of movement, trains, taxis, people moving toward destinations that no longer included me. And that was good. That was earned. I sat down finally across from them, folding my hands neatly over the table. And for the next 2 hours, I walked them through every critical point they had overlooked. Not to gloat, not to wound, to close the door properly. At the end, Martin leaned back, exhausted. Not from talking, from realizing how much he had thrown away. I gathered my things without hurry. As I rose, I paused for one final look at the room. The long shadows, the heavy chairs, the forgotten promises etched into the walls. Then I walked out without looking back. They didn't ask for a follow-up. They knew better. I left my name printed on the visitor log, and nothing else. The first day at my new office, no one knew my history. No one knew what I had built, what I had lost, what I had chosen not to save. They only knew what I could do now. The walls were glass, but the light was different here, warm, diffuse, not sterile like before. No slogans etched into the halls. No forced smiles. Just quiet, deliberate movement. The kind of energy that comes from people who are trusted to know what they're doing. I set my bag down by a clean, uncluttered desk. No nameplate yet. No ceremony. Just space, mine to fill or leave bare. Mid-morning, I was asked to lead a workshop, a systems mapping session for a group of younger engineers, many just starting their careers. I almost said no. Not because I doubted myself, but because part of me still remembered what it felt like to give too much to a place that only knew how to take. But then I looked at them, faces open, expectant, and realized teaching wasn't a vulnerability. It was an inheritance. If I didn't hand it forward carefully, someone else would hand it down carelessly, and the cycle would start again. I stood at the front of the room, a whiteboard behind me, a marker uncapped in my hand. The hum of low conversation died out naturally, without needing to be silenced. They were ready. I drew the first line slowly, letting the black ink glide across the board in one clean, confident motion. Systems fail when you treat them like products. I said, voice even. They survive when you treat them like relationships. The room shifted, people sitting straighter. Noted. As the session unfolded, I moved through the architecture diagrams like tracing old scars. Except this time, they didn't hurt. They just marked where I had healed. I taught them about invisible load, silent bottlenecks, the risks hidden in easy wins. I didn't talk about my old company. Not once. Because what mattered wasn't the collapse. It was the rebuilding in systems, in people, in myself. At lunch, one of the junior developers lingered behind, a quiet young woman with thick glasses and a nervous way of holding her coffee cup too tightly. She waited until most others had filed out before stepping closer. "Ms. Harper," she said, voice hesitant, "how did you learn to see the things no one else notices?" I smiled, a real one, the kind that starts somewhere deep in your chest before it reaches your mouth. "You don't start by looking at the system," I said. "You start by listening to what isn't said." She nodded slowly, like she understood, even if she couldn't explain it yet. Good, better to learn it young. Later that afternoon, as the sun shifted lower across the sky, I stood by the window of my new office. The city stretched wide and endless before me, gray and gold and unfinished. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I felt necessary. Not because of a title, not because of a salary, because of the work, the real work. The kind that doesn't need applause to matter. I didn't come back to get revenge. I came back to rebuild first myself, then the world around me, and maybe that's the real victory, not making them regret losing you, but making sure you never lose yourself again.